A young man named Dan trudged gloomily along the autumn street. It had been drizzling ugly rain since morning, and the sky seemed to be covered with gray curtains, dull and melancholic. The weather perfectly reflected the guy's state of mind. Today he got fired from his job. They didn't even give him notice, the jerks. Although he hadn't done anything wrong, just regularly arrived late. Once it was because of a farewell party. He was seeing off a childhood friend to the army and didn't show up for work. So now he was left without money, and a few hours later, without a place to stay. He lived with his girlfriend at her place. Lisa had inherited the apartment from her grandmother. They had been dating for 6 months, and a couple of months ago they started living together. Before that, Dan rented an apartment with 2 friends, which was profitable but very inconvenient even for him, an unpretentious 20-year-old guy. A guy who had lived in a dormitory with his mother since childhood. But the guys turned their place into such a pigsty that even his dormitory, with perpetually drunk guys and women keeping up with them, seemed like a model of cleanliness and decency. Unlike Dan, the guys came from intact families and had spent their entire childhood in comfortable separate apartments where strict parents restricted and constantly watched over them. And now, having escaped from under this guardianship, the guys let loose as they could. Endless parties, gatherings, as teenagers now fashionably call it. The apartment turned into a dump with perpetually unwashed dishes, a floor littered with cigarette butts and condoms, and the smell of alcohol and sweat. At first, Dan tried to maintain order somehow, but realizing the futility of these attempts, he gave up. So he was very happy when Lisa suggested moving in together. But today she kicked him out too. She said she was tired of his irresponsibility and endless hangouts with his boozy friends, and she had outgrown the relationship altogether. For the time being, he decided to crash at James's place. He lived alone, but when asked by his friend to stay with him, he reacted without much enthusiasm. So Dan wouldn't be able to stay there for long. But thanks anyway. At least he wouldn't be on the street. Dan decided to focus on job hunting intensively in the morning. And today, he needed to try to distract himself. He had no energy for worries or even thoughts about the future. Tomorrow, everything's tomorrow. James arranged Dan on a folding bed in his tiny kitchen, so he slept, squeezed between the old gas stove and the rickety table covered with a flower-patterned tablecloth. In the morning, Dan immediately got on the computer. There were plenty of job openings, but very few that suited him. Everywhere they demanded experience or special education, or both. If that wasn't required, they paid peanuts, barely enough to feed a cat, let alone a healthy young body. And then Dan saw something suitable. They needed a night watchman at the morgue, paying $2 grand per shift. It was a clean job. Sit quietly, play on your phone. Dan wasn't afraid of dead bodies, didn't believe in the supernatural. Living people are what you should be afraid of, his grandmother used to say, and he completely agreed with her. So he immediately went to the specified address. His future workplace was almost on the outskirts of the city, a small one-story building in a wasteland surrounded by sparse, withering trees. It looked quite grim and evoked thoughts of the transience of existence. The door was opened by a man in his 60s, completely gray-haired, with colorless eyes. He weakly shook the applicant's hand and introduced himself as Victor. Dan asked about his patronymic. "No patronymic," Victor replied. "I'm not that old yet, just turned 38 recently." Dan was shocked. Well, his life had been turned upside down. The guy didn't seem like a drinker. No characteristic red veins around his nose, and his eyes weren't hazy or reddened with a network of burst vessels, as they always are with them. And Dan had seen quite a few drunks in his short life, almost becoming an expert in them. Victor invited him inside to the last refuge of souls. They entered a small room with an old pot-bellied TV. Cheap blue wallpaper, worn linoleum, a table with an electric kettle, a poster from 2 years ago on the wall. That was the entire setting. Yes, there was also a small refrigerator in the corner, which rumbled like a dump truck. "The job isn't difficult, but not everyone can sit all night next to corpses," said Victor. Dan assured him that corpses didn't scare him, and he was ready to start his duties right away. I need money desperately, Dan confessed. And the dead, well, they're quiet. They just lie there. This suits me much more than working with people. I worked as a loader in a store before, and there were nothing but bosses there, and every cashier wanted to boss me around. You put this wrong, you drank. Ugh. Dan waved his hand irritably. Victor nodded understandingly. I understand, but still, it's not as simple as it seems. Though, if you're determined, go for it. $2,000 per shift, payment daily, though without official paperwork for now. Weekends, Saturday, Sunday. If everything suits you, let's go. I'll show you the work area. Dan was fine with everything, and they left the guard's room. Walking forward through the narrow corridor, Dan saw the autopsy table, a row of refrigerators, and a little further away, in a room without a door, several metal beds with sheets covering them. Bare feet with tags on the toes protruded from under the sheets. These haven't been autopsied yet, his partner explained. Here's a young girl and a driver from an accident. I wouldn't recommend looking. He doesn't have a face. Dan felt uneasy. A sticky fear crawled up his spine. And the girl? The guy asked, not in his own voice. The girl died of a heart attack so young, but the forensic pathologist will determine it exactly tomorrow. The girl wasn't married, and they'll probably bury her in a wedding dress. It's a tradition. I've been working here for a long time, studied all these rules. I've seen it all here. So much grief, Victor added grimly. And then, after the autopsy, the bodies are placed in these compartments. Victor pointed to the refrigerators. The morgue operates every day, only Sunday is off. But since there's only one night guard, you'll have 2 days off. And yes, leave your passport. I'll make a copy tomorrow when you leave. But Dan was prepared for the interview and a copy of his passport, as well as his birth certificate and diplomas from school and a vocational school, were with him. Victor chuckled. Your passport is enough for me. Keep your diplomas for yourself. Soon they said goodbye, and Dan was left alone. Well, not entirely alone, of course. Victor kindly left him instant coffee and a pack of cookies. He didn't feel like eating. No, Dan wasn't squeamish, and there wasn't much of a smell in the room. At least, not as strong as he expected. Dan put the kettle on and stared out of the small, dark window. It was pitch black outside. Not even the moon or stars were visible. Probably because of the rain, the guy thought, and decided to have some coffee and watch a movie. An hour later, unable to find a suitable movie, Dan started to doze off, resting his head on his hands. He couldn't find a movie because all he stumbled upon were thrillers and horror films. He understood that there was nothing to be afraid of, but he didn't want to watch anything eerie at night, let alone in the morgue. He had enough excitement and adrenaline without that. Then, in Dan's foggy, approaching sleep brain, some strange, wrong sounds began to penetrate. A voice. It was definitely a voice, but whose? A couple of minutes later, he realized that it was calling his name, Dan. Dan, Daniel, came from the depths of the morgue. Dan's throat went dry, and his head seemed to be gripped by icy terror. He tried to compose himself and find a rational explanation for what was happening. Most likely, his idiotic friends decided to prank him. It was just like them. Dan turned on his phone. It was already 12:30 at night. Dan went outside and circled the building. No one. Then, he decisively returned to his workplace and turned on the movie. It was just my imagination, the guy thought, and decided not to fall asleep anymore. He'd get some sleep at home, at James's place. And this was not the best place for Morpheus's embrace. Who knows what else might come up here? But the sounds didn't stop despite the headphones in his ears, as if penetrating his brain. He heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, shuffling steps. Impossible in this place, but no less real. Each step resonated with a dull pain in his temples, and cold sweat poured down his back. The steps were getting closer and closer. Dan couldn't bear it and pulled the headphones out of his ears. He sat very straight, staring at the door, or rather at the doorknob. Strangely, without the headphones, he no longer heard the sounds behind the door, or rather he heard them, but more muffled, as if from a distance. The doorknob began to turn slowly. From horror, Dan stopped breathing. A turn, another one, and the footsteps began to fade towards the mortuary. After waiting for about 20 minutes, Dan slowly opened the door and went there. He needed to check. He had to make sure it was just his imagination. As he walked down the corridor, he heard something hitting the window of his room, as if someone threw a stone at it. Not big enough to break the glass, but the impact was clearly audible. Dan felt like the corridor was getting longer. It was so dreadful for him. Right now, he wanted to be anywhere but here, even at the dorm with his mom, or even in the pigsty with his friends. His whole being resisted moving toward the mortuary, as if an ancient instinct and belief in the afterlife had awakened inside him. But Dan kept going. He had to prove to his fear that there was nothing there, just dead bodies waiting for autopsies. And tomorrow morning, the forensic pathologist would come here to perform the autopsy and determine the cause of their death. That's all there was to it, and there was no mystique or mystery here. Dan had already passed through the refrigeration compartments and entered the room with the bodies. Holding his breath, he approached the cot where the girl should be lying and partially uncovered the sheet. Dan saw the girl's body. Her eyes were open, seeming to gaze into the unknown and abyss, somewhere inaccessible to the living. She lay naked and submissive to her fate. Dan remembered the words of his partner Victor about the grieving mother and the wedding dress, which the poor girl hadn't worn in life. Yielding to a sudden impulse, he squeezed the hand of the dead girl. It pained him deeply, feeling sorry for her. How unjustly everything was arranged in this life. Murderers and villains live to a ripe old age, leaving their offspring on Earth. And a young, beautiful girl lies here on a cold metal cot instead of being in her lover's embrace, enjoying life. Dan carefully covered the body with the sheet and, without turning back, went to his room. He noticed a crack on the window. Who could have thrown a stone? Dan went outside again and circled the building several times. Luckily, he had a powerful flashlight with him. There was no one around, just miles of wasteland. No residential buildings, only rare trees and emptiness. Dan shuddered and hurried back to his guard post. An unpleasant thought came to him that he was completely alone here and help wouldn't come soon if something happened. Dan sat down at the table and stared unblinkingly out the window. He began to feel drowsy again, apparently due to the experiences of the past few days, and the night had been, to put it mildly, restless. He fell asleep sitting upright in his chair. Suddenly, someone's cold hand touched his shoulder. Dan startled and opened his eyes. The window was fogged up, and someone had written on the glass with their hand, "You're my groom." Whose cruel joke was this? Maybe his friends were standing behind him, laughing at him. But when Dan turned sharply, he saw the girl, the same dead girl. She stood right behind him, no longer naked. A white sheet was draped around her body like a wedding dress. The girl looked straight into his eyes. Dan wanted to scream, but couldn't. He followed her like a puppet. Then he saw the mutilated corpse approaching them. It had no face, just a bloody mess. "That's the driver," echoed in Dan's mind. There was no more fear, only numbness and detachment. It was as if only a lifeless shell remained of him. "That's our chauffeur," a genderless voice sounded in Dan's head. In the hands of the faceless corpse were 2 red roses. Then the doors of the refrigerators began to open, and bodies with slit and hastily stitched chests crawled out. A funeral march began to play. "These are our guests," the voice sounded again somewhere in Dan's head. There were more and more bodies. Dan thought detachedly that there couldn't be so many here. They swayed, crawled, shuffled toward him. Then, as if waking up, Dan screamed. He screamed until his chest hurt. It felt like his heart had broken his ribs. Dan woke up from a heavy sleep on the floor of his guard post. It was already dawn. Victor was shaking him. "Happy first day at work," his partner said sadly, with a baptism of fire, so to speak. He helped Dan up and sat him down on a chair. "Have a drink." Dan's throat burned from the vodka. Victor handed him some money. "Come back tomorrow if you haven't changed your mind," Victor said with a wry smile. There shouldn't be any more mischief. They usually entertain themselves like this on the first day of work, arranging an initiation ceremony. Dan couldn't come to his senses. He just stood up and, staggering on unsteady legs, headed for the exit. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his reflection in a small round mirror hanging on the wall near the guard post's door. A completely gray-haired man of indeterminate age was staring back at him. Outside, Dan saw a woman in mourning attire. She looked at him for a long time, smiling as if they had been well acquainted for a long time. Dan shuddered and, without turning back, quickly walked towards the bus stop.